Welcome to the JCC's Book and Author Conversation with A.J. Sigransky. I'm Connie Cirillo-Freeman, Director of the Center for Arts and Culture here at the JCC. We strive to offer a variety of opportunities for enrichment to our diverse membership and community. We're so glad that you were able to join us this evening. We want to thank our arts and culture volunteers for their invaluable help. We also want to thank our partners, the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County and Stanford Hadassah, for their support. It has been a pleasure to talk and get to know AJ during the planning of this program, albeit virtually. And special thanks to Tanya Wilk-Weiss for her coaching. Our goal is to present conversations with prominent authors of topical and compelling books. The talks promise to educate, enlighten, and entertain. So it's our pleasure to welcome AJ Sigransky to the JCC. Shortlisted for Best Historical Fiction in 2020 at the Next Generation Indie Book Awards, The Interpreter is the first installment in the new Justice series, featuring protagonist Kurt Berlin. A gripping mystery, The Interpreter is an important story. An acclaimed and prolific writer, his first novel, Forgiving Maximo Rothman, was selected by the National Jewish Book Awards as a finalist in Outstanding Debut Fiction. His second novel, Stealing a Summer's Afternoon, was a finalist for Best Second Novel. Forgiving Mariela Camacho, his third work, received the David Award for Best Mystery of 2016. We're also very happy to, one thing I wanted to say also is that he has a new book in the Forgiving series. It's due out in December. And he's also working on a new novel and short stories and a major anthology due out in 2021. So he's a very busy person. We're also very happy to welcome back Tanya Wilk-Weiss, multi-Emmy Award-winning documentary producer at Alan Weiss Productions. Tanya changed careers in order to enter the not-for-profit world. She is the longtime facilitator of our JCC Book Club, and she is currently the executive director of the cancer support team in Westchester County. Previously, she was a case manager with the Claims Conference Holocaust Survivor Program at Westchester Jewish Communities and the events manager at UJA JCC of Greenwich. On a personal note, my mother, at the age of 12, with her mother and father and brother, fled to Holland to escape Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. In 1938, at the age of 17, she was sent to New York with the expectation that they would soon follow her. However, they never made it. But she had a first cousin who was also a German Jewish refugee who made it to New York. He graduated from high school and he joined the army. And he served in Belgium and France and Germany from 1944 to 1946. And he was a translator in the OSS. So AJ's story is at once familiar and eye-opening as he explores the many aspects of human response to loss, guilt, resilience, and good and evil. So we will entertain questions at the end of the talk, time permitting. Please enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much, Connie, and welcome, Alan. So I think it's important, because not everyone has had a chance to actually read the book. Why don't we give just a little bit of background? So it's set in 2 different time frames, but it's the same set of characters. Explain that.
All right. So there are several different parts of the story, and my writing style is such that I generally incorporate a shorter period of time, a story that happens in a shorter period of time as the main story, and then I also present the backstory. So that's why it's presented in two different time frames. And originally, when I wrote this story, I wrote it chronologically. So it started in 1938 and ended in 1945. But I found that stylistically, it was better to present the story in this way, where you gave the reader some information about what was going on in the main story, which was very compelling, and then you flash back for the reader to fill them in on what had led to that.
So the protagonist in 1945 has been a soldier in the U.S. Army, and he is asked to be an interpreter for the OSS in Belgium with captured Nazi army officers, thank you. But the backstory is that he himself had lived in Belgium as a 15-year-old, and that he had fled from Austria. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
That's the background. That gives everybody at least a bit of information. Okay, it's very much a personal story for you in some ways. And I know other books that you have worked on and are working on are also personal stories. What aspects have you called upon in the lives of people in your own family?
All right, well, I'd like to talk a little bit about how this came about. So Kurt Berlin, the real Kurt Berlin, was married to my mother's first cousin. And he was born in Belgium. He was born in Vienna. And he was actually 12 years old when this happened, but I aged the character for dramatic reasons. And he was sent on a Kindertransport to Belgium, and he was waiting there to meet his parents. Now, when I heard this story the first time, I was astounded because it's a very, very exceptional story. Kurt actually felt it was not exceptional, but I differed in opinion with him. Because of what the lengths that his parents went through in order to leave. So it was a fascinating story. So I drew on this, but at the same time, I needed to find other avenues to expand the story and turn it into a larger story that it could be carried in a novel. So I had, many years ago, I was in the commercial mortgage business, and I had a client who had actually served in the interpretation unit in the OSS during World War II. He was born in the United States, but his parents were very wealthy Viennese Jews who had moved to the United States in 1920. So I was very close with him, and he used to tell me the stories about what it was like for him being a Jewish soldier in the United States Army and working in this unit. And it's interesting because this unit was pretty much all Jewish refugees, kids who had grown up in the German language. And then they come to the United States, they become American citizens, they were in the war, and the United States Army needed translators, and they needed interpreters in order to get accurate interpretations of the interrogations they were making of captured Nazis. So what I did was I wove the two stories together. I aged the Kurt Berlin character by 5 years. He's 17 years old when he leaves Vienna and arrives in Brussels, and then he's a few years old. He's like 19 or 20 years old when they actually leave Europe and arrive in the United States. He goes into the army. He's fighting in the Pacific, in the Philippines, and that's where he is tapped by the army to come back to Brussels. And he comes back to Brussels for his own reasons. He has his own agenda. He doesn't really want to do this, but he's looking for the girl he left behind.
So let's talk a little bit about Kindertransport, because obviously you base this partially on a person who really was on a Kindertransport. Connie just mentioned that with her mother. I also have a cousin who was born in 1920. His family moved further into Prussia at that time to escape Nazism, which was not a good move, unfortunately. He wasn't part of Kindertransport, but at 19, my American great-grandfather was able to get him out through England and then to the United States. So my family also, it's not quite Kindertransport, but he was only 19. And then he did actually go back and in the US military, and he was a translator. So, you know, a lot of your book really resonated with me. So let's talk about Kindertransport, because I think it's something that a lot of the people that are watching have family members who potentially participated in that. Talk a little bit more about your research into that.
Sure. Let me tell you a little bit about the Kindertransport program. So the Kindertransport program, it literally means child transport in German, was very unique, and it was exclusive to the areas controlled by the Nazi Reich. So it became evident by 1937 that that the Jews were in tremendous peril. And it was necessary to start to try to get the children out because the borders were pretty much closed. It was very, very difficult for a family unit to leave Germany, both because the Nazis put roadblocks in their way and also for them to find a place to go. You know, interestingly, the only country that took extensive Jewish resettlement or made an offer for extensive Jewish resettlement in 1938 was the Dominican Republic at the Avion Conference, which is what my first novel, my debut novel, Forgiving Maxwell Rothman, is about that. But with the Kindertransports, these children were sent to various places. Most of them went to London, if not immediately thereafter. But some were held in Amsterdam, in Brussels, and in Paris. So it was available for children between 3 and 18 years old, and literally tens of thousands of children were saved in this manner. What is unique about the Kindertransport is the fact that it actually happened, that these parents were willing to do whatever they could to save their children, knowing full well that they might never see them again. And I have known many people who came out on Kindertransports. I live in Washington Heights, which was heavily settled by German Jewish refugees, and a number of my neighbors came out on Kindertransports. And usually, if they didn't come out with their siblings, they never saw their siblings again. They never saw their parents again. I will tell you one interesting little story, which is that as I mentioned, Kurt was married to my mother's first cousin. So I was very close with them growing up. And I once asked Susan why our family, which was in Hungary, didn't send the children out the way that was done with Kurt. Mm-hmm. And first of all, they didn't have Kindertransports coming out of Prague or Budapest or any of these places at that time. But more importantly, she said to me that Hungarian Jews could never have done this. There was something in the cultural character of the German and Austrian Jews that provided them the emotional strength to stand on the platform with a smile and wave goodbye to their children. And their children did the same thing from the other side of the glass window without losing it. That this was unique to their culture. And that in itself is a pretty amazing thing, that you think what a parent will do for their child to save them, even if it means not saving themselves.
So let's talk a bit about Kurt's family and their idea of leaving and planning to leave, because the Kindertransport was only part one. They really did put plans in place to get out of Vienna. And what I found interesting about that was that the Austrian Jews, as you point out in the book, were very assimilated. They dressed like their non-Jewish colleagues. They looked like them. They worked alongside them. They fought in World War I with them. They really were Austrian in as much as they were Jewish. And I know from other people whom I've met that they considered themselves Austrian first. What do you respond to that? I mean, you did a lot of research.
Okay, so let me say a few things about this. The first thing I want to say with regards to this is that, and this is not to denigrate anyone within our community and the different, we have a very, very diverse community, and certainly the community was very diverse in Europe at that time. So the first thing I want to say with respect to this is that while there were many, many people who went to the camps and some escaped, who were involved in the Holocaust, who were Orthodox Jews who came from small villages in Poland. 3 million victims of the Holocaust came from Poland. So yes, it's what I call the Tevye syndrome. There's this picture in your mind of what a Holocaust victim looks like, and it tends to look like someone from Fiddler on the Roof. The truth, though, is that throughout Europe, Italy, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, in these countries, the Jews were much more assimilated. They spoke the language of the nation. They had the same jobs as their neighbors. They lived among the Gentile population. One day they woke up and they were no longer a part of that population.
And what made them know it was time to start really thinking about leaving?
So there's a great question. And part of the problem with that question is that you don't really know when it's time to leave. In the case of Kurt and his family, First of all, as Kurt said in every interview with him, my father was a very smart man. He was a very smart guy. I didn't know him because he died just shortly before I was born, but I've gleaned information from my parents and, Kurt's wife, Susan, about him over the years. He was a very, very smart guy. He was an interesting guy. He was actually born in Austrian Galicia, which is now Poland. He came to Vienna after World War I. He met the woman he married, and this woman, Berta Rosenblatt, her family was established in Vienna for a long time, and they owned a business. They owned a prosperous business. It was a coffee, they made coffee, and they ground coffee, and they sold coffee. And in Vienna, that's a big deal. They drink a lot of, if you've ever been to Vienna, there's a lot of coffee. And you order
Mitschlag. Cafe Mitschlag.
Mitschlag, exactly. And you order it by the color. So they saw what was coming. And interestingly, and this is implied, but the story is not in this book. So they realized in the around 1937 that they had to start to look to get out. So Berta had a sister whose name was Lena, and her married name was Gittel. And Lena was a student of Maria Montessori.
Oh.
So Maria Montessori had an opportunity to send one student in 1937, I think it was, to the United States to open up a school in Washington, D.C. So she sent Lena to save her life because she could get a Jew out of Austria. And when Lena got here, she started applying for visas for them to come. In the meantime, they started to get rid of stuff. Before, look, it was always at a discount because once the Nazis once they invaded 1938, that was it. You were not selling for a dollar on a dollar. You were selling for a lot less.
So, Alan, in previous interviews and in our conversation, I have learned that in some ways there were three basic things that a Jew needed to be able to get out. You want to, sufficient funds, right? That was first.
Right, sufficient funds.
And then a little bit of luck.
Correct.
And the third one, which I found the most interesting, was the help of Gentiles.
Yes, and this is absolutely true. Now, I've done a lot of research on this, and in this case in particular, they had the help of their Gentile neighbors.
Are you speaking about the real story, or are you speaking about the book? Because that clearly is the case with the book.
The real story. The backstory presented in the story is substantially true. I didn't fit with the story. They had the help of their neighbors. For instance, one scene that didn't get into the book because the original manuscript was 550 pages. Happens, and no one's publishing that. Happens on Kristallnacht, and this was true. When Berta got to the police station where Hertz was being held, the Nazi guard was the shoemaker that they had used for 20 years. And she was able, though he was a Nazi, she was able to get Hertz released because she knew him. So, and both, with cooperation and good intention and without cooperation and good intention, you had to have the help of a Gentile. They had the help of Gentiles, people who helped them along each step of the way a little bit, to hide them, to give, to do something for them, to help them. But that is absolutely true.
False documents. I mean, there were a lot of, especially, I mean, obviously I'm not familiar with the real story, but just in reading the novel, and I want to, kind of stick with that because that's what our people watching may be familiar with. You write about Berta taking her gold jewelry and melting it into rods to then be fitted into her corset. Is that based on a real story?
That actually happened. Okay, wow. That actually happened. That was what drew me to this story more than anything else. From the first time I heard it, I said, wait, stop. And this is what they did. She was left, first of all, she was left alone in Vienna. And imagine this.
No, I can't imagine it, but go on.
A Jewish woman in 1939, she's alone in Vienna. Now, women, they didn't exactly have the power that, a woman might have today, or that a man certainly had then. She had to take this stuff to someone. She had to take, and it wasn't just jewelry as I presented as just jewelry, but they had cash, they had some other valuables. They converted all of the valuables to cash. They then bought gold with the cash.
I see.
Then they took the gold and had it melted down, and they had to replaced the girdles, the steel rods and the girdles, with these gold rods.
Amazing.
And how they smuggled money out of Germany. You know, and she could have gotten caught more than once, and she had to do this alone. So to me, this woman who was so demure, who when she was sitting on the couch and her bag was at her feet, she would say, "Kurt, bring me my bag." And he would get up, walk across the room, pick up the bag and hand it to her. This is who she was. But the emotional strength that this woman had astounded me from the first time that I heard this story.
So let's talk a little bit about the title. You don't call it the translator. You call it the interpreter.
Well, there are two different things.
Yeah, what's the difference?
A translator works primarily from written material, where they take a page and they translate it from one language to another. An interpreter translates in real time. An interpreter sits in front of the subject, they hear the word, and they have to do simultaneous translation into, in this case, English, so that the other person who's doing the interrogating can actually understand what's being said. Now, the interpreter, there are more subtle reasons for the name also. He needs to interpret his experience in order to come out of this hole. And that really manifests itself towards the end of the book. And I don't want to give away too much for people who haven't read the book.
But it's interesting. I mean, I think it's enough to be said that the character whom he is translating, doing the interpretation for, is not just a Nazi, but has some interaction with not only Kurt, but his family prior in the previous part of the timeline of the book. And it becomes increasingly more difficult for your protagonist to be listening to the things that this man is saying. And it's interpreting also the emotion behind it, or lack thereof, in the case of this person, that is so profound, I think.
Thank you for that, saying that. Yes. Look, one of the things that I wanted to accomplish, perhaps the most important thing I wanted to accomplish, and it's why I believe fiction is an important teaching tool with the Holocaust in particular, is I wanted people to understand and to feel the emotional discomfort and almost terror that Kurt was feeling as he heard the words coming from this Nazi, and realizing how these words had affected his life, and very directly. But at the same time, he had to maintain his composure because he had to do this job. He had to translate in real time. He had to interpret these words. And interpretation also, it goes to the significance of nuance in meaning. That a word in German could have a very specific meaning in a dictionary, but only a person in any language, only a person who's intimate with that language can understand what it really means. And that's why the U.S. Army set up this unit, because they didn't want people who knew German. They wanted people who understood and spoke German. So yes, for him, I wanted the reader to get to this place where they were there with him and they were feeling his discomfort. And I have to tell you, I'm very proud of this, that a number of reviewers, professional reviewers, and a number of readers have specifically mentioned this, that they were so caught up in his emotions that it was almost uncomfortable for them to read how he was feeling. And that's exactly what I was going for. I want people to understand this. And the reason that I wanted this is that today we live in a time when the teaching of the Holocaust is done, and there's plenty of it, but we're entering a period where there's fewer and fewer survivors alive. There's less and less contact, especially for younger people, with them. And the statistics on American youth and what they do and don't know about the Holocaust are very frightening. I feel that numbers and facts are one thing, and we need that. But I think when you give a book like this to an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old, and they can read this and they're the same age as the protagonist, and they can feel what he's feeling, they get a better feel for what really happened and why it's so important that we remember it.
So you and I spoke about the idea that a series like The Hunters, which is on currently, I don't recall if it's Prime or Netflix.
Good question.
Is important, even if they play with facts, because the idea is to keep the topic alive, and to make sure that the next generation is very clear on what this Holocaust took place, what really happened. So even if they, don't exactly present, real stories in these scenes each week, that at least the concept of what the Nazis were doing is there presented, and people can learn more. Talk about that a little bit.
There's been a lot of controversy about this one specific program, and I saw it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There are some serious historical errors.
Mm-hmm.
There are gaps in terms of the ages of people. There are a lot of problems with it, but I think that despite all of this, it's important. And the reason it's important is exactly what you mentioned, that it will attract a younger viewer who has very little experience with the subject. And it may, I think the point of it is that to interest them enough that they will pursue more study, more reading, they'll have more curiosity about what happened, and they may actually take an interest and learn it. And it's presented in a way that's really written, I mean, as a writer, I mean, let's be honest about this, different books or scripts are written for different audiences. This is written for a younger audience. So if someone who's, 80 years old who is intimate with this on a personal level sees this, they're going to be appalled. Okay. But you know what? If someone who's 22 sees it and they don't know the first thing about the Holocaust, and they start to see what happened, they may say, you know what, I'd like to read more about this. And they have this wonderful thing that we didn't have when we were 22, which is Google. And it's in the palm of their hand, and they can Google anything at any time, and they can get an answer. It's like walking around with an encyclopedia. So overall, my reaction to it was that I think it's a good thing, not a bad thing. If I can make one more comment with respect to this, I differ a little, though, relative to the writing novels about the Holocaust. And I'm going to, just quickly, there has been a big controversy in the Jewish literary world about certain books that were set in concentration camps that were written by people who had no clear connection to anyone who'd ever been in a concentration camp. And a couple of these, it has turned out, in the end, were completely fabricated. Mm. And some of them were made into movies and series. So there is a question of cultural appropriation. And I believe that it's one thing to write about the experience of the Holocaust. In my case, I really write about the refugee experience because I'm close to it. Much of my family was involved in that, so I know these stories and I understand that. The one thing I don't do is I don't write a scene in a concentration camp, ever. Because as Elie Wiesel said, you can't write a novel about Treblinka, because if it's about Treblinka, it can't be a novel. And if it's a novel, it can't possibly be about Treblinka. So my feeling is that writers have to be a little more careful than whoever wrote the script for Hunters. I think we have to have a genuine story that needs to be told, and I think we have to have a connection to it, and it can't be just done because it's going to sell well commercially.
Fair. So let's go back to the book.
Right.
I want to know why there's really no way to ask this question without giving away a major plot line. So those who haven't finished the plot, go away for 5 minutes. At any rate, the question I have is, at the end, Kurt decides not to kill this Nazi. He has the power and he chooses not to. And why did you make that decision for him?
Okay, so it's really interesting that I was discussing this with someone today. And I did not make a final decision about that until I was 1 or 2 scenes before it. Mm. And that happens to be my writing style. I rarely know, I write murder mysteries, and I generally don't know who the murderer is until I'm about 2/3 of the way into the story.
Really? So you don't do an outline and have it all known?
Yeah, I don't do any outlining. I'm a pantser.
Okay.
Right by the seat of my pants. So, okay, the question is, should von Hauptmann have survived?
Right.
There were 2 reasons. One of them is a really cheap reason, which is that I decided I needed him for the second book.
That's a cheap reason. Go ahead.
That's a cheap reason. The other reason was a moral reason. It was a moral issue. Mm-hmm. I said to myself, here's this young man who's been through terrible stuff. I mean, he has seen more at the age of 23 than people see in a lifetime. He's experienced all kinds of terror. He's seen terrible things. And he's paired up with another 23-year-old who's lost his entire family. He's lost his entire family in the Holocaust. And they were friends before the war, and they find each other in Brussels. And they have they're not in a position to kill von Hauptmann. But he looks at Saul and he says, what would our fathers and our teachers have told us to do?
Mm-hmm.
And he realizes that if they kill von Hauptmann, they become as bad as von Hauptmann. Von Hauptmann is as bad as you can get. And I made him that way. I mean, that's the bottom line. No one has said to me, gee, nobody could be that bad. You know what? He's that bad. And he's that bad because the Nazis were that bad. All right? There was no mercy in them. So in order for him to be able to come to some peace with his own life, and for Saul to come to peace with his own life, because he's in there with him, they have to do the right thing. Now, I did leave it a little murky, because there is an intervening moment when the power is taken away from him to make the decision. But I felt that, he was 23. A 23-year-old, for any of us who have children in their 20s, we know. They're adults, but not quite. And so he needed a little bit of help there, and he got that little bit of help. But I felt that if he killed von Hauptmann, he would never be able to get over it. That he needed, as a young man, he needed to come to a peace with his own experience. And that's what I felt that gave him.
Good. I have 2 more book questions and then a broader question for you. But I also want to suggest to those that have questions that they could start using the Q&A and sending Connie some questions, because we will allow some time for your questions as well. Okay, Alan, my question is about the theme of identity. And the woman whom Kurt meets and helps their children together in Brussels, and he basically falls in love with her, and she's Jewish, but not really, and never knew it, and yet was having to flee. Talk a little bit about her. So
that's Elsa, and Elsa's the love interest. Elsa, just, on the record, is fictional, completely fictional. I included Elsa for a number of reasons. First of all, as a writer, and look, I don't claim to write literary fiction. I write commercial fiction, genre fiction, and I'm very proud of it, and I'm pretty good at it. Mm-hmm. But it requires certain elements, and one really important element in a contemporary novel is a love interest. I mean, even if you look at something like Dan Brown, he always has, there's always the sidekick is a woman, and somewhere along the line, two-thirds of the book, she becomes a love interest. It's necessary for the reader. So I needed a love interest, which is why I aged Kurt from 12 to 17, because 12 years old wasn't having a love interest.
No.
What I wanted to examine there was a couple of things, very specific things. First of all, I wanted to examine the status of people of mixed parentage in the Reich. In German, they're referred to as Mischling, which is kind of a derogatory term. And there was a whole hierarchy of analysis as to where you stood on the Mischling chart and what it meant for your social status in the society. Mm. And I wanted to look at this, and I wanted to present this to readers, and particularly to Jewish readers, because I think that it's important, particularly in light of the fact that I maintain that so many of the people who were so seriously affected by the Holocaust were so assimilated, and so many of them had Christians in their family, that it's important to understand that there are elements of this that, while it's a very unique event in history and a Jewish event in history, there were elements of this that extended to people who were not Jewish in their identity. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of identity is the central theme in all of my novels. That's what I write about. Because I believe that while you're born to a certain identity, you don't necessarily have to embrace that identity. You can pick your identity, you can change your identity. Identity can be fluid. You can be more than one thing at one time. As you mentioned earlier, that there were Austrians they were Austrian Jews, and they were Austrian and they were Jews. So I'm kind of, this is a main topic for me, this issue of identity. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about in this particular situation, and I structured it very specifically, was the Nazis were insane when it came to art. Mm. So I specifically made her father an artist, a modern artist, because Hitler railed against modern art. And he persecuted artists. So I wanted to complicate her situation. She was half Jewish. She was not raised as a Jew. She was raised as a Christian.
It's her father who's Jewish.
Father was
So
Jewish.
in
So
very
exactly.
Orthodox circles,
Exactly.
she would not have been considered Jewish.
Exactly. So she's caught betwixt and between. And when she goes to Brussels, she's placed in this home with Kurt, and the people who are hosting them are Orthodox. And she's like, she's living in a world where she can't breathe at all. She has no idea, what is going on. So what does she cling to? What does she search out? Something familiar. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, she connects with this nun in a church nearby the place where they live. And that becomes a very, very important factor in the story. And I felt it expanded the story a little bit, and it gave it an interesting, an interesting view. I think that as we tell stories of the Holocaust, we have to continue to tell stories with some newness to them, and different circumstances. And we could tell stories for another 100 years, and we wouldn't cover all of it.
So true. Let's talk about Captain Rosenthal. He's a minor character, but what I thought that was interesting for me, he is Kurt's direct report, so to speak. Right. He is his boss. He is also Jewish, and yet he doesn't seem to have any of the issues that Kurt has, listening to the atrocities that this Nazi is discussing and saying what he did, etc. And also, he, to some degree, you get the sense that he wants to deny he's an American Jew, so he hasn't lived through the war firsthand from the Jewish experience, so to speak. But it's like as if he doesn't want to admit it, even to Kurt, that he is Jewish. It's like, don't talk to me about that. Don't discuss this with me. Why? Why did you make him like that?
So first of all, I know I appreciate that you read the book, but he actually was born in Berlin. And what he's based on, and he says in the first chapter, he says, I'm kind of like you, I'm from, and when he speaks German, Kurt recognizes the Berlin accent. So where did he come from? And it was an interesting thing is he's actually, I developed him out of a story that came out of a magazine article that I read about a guy who was already in like 93, 94 years old when this article was written, and this was several years ago, so he's probably 100 if he's still alive. He was the only son of a very, very assimilated Jewish family who owned a newspaper. Oh. And they lived down the street from Hitler. Oh, and his father and his uncle were convinced that they could make some kind of accommodation with Hitler about themselves and the Jews, but ultimately were thrown out of the country. Literally thrown out of the country. So for some reason, this really stuck with me for years. So I used this sort of as a template to develop him. He wants nothing to do with anything Jewish, like this man's father and uncle. He's not interested. He's a German. He was forced out of Germany, and now he's going to be an American. And he's going to pal around, and he's going to play into the military hierarchy as best he can. He may come back, and I'm considering bringing him back in this next book.
Okay. So in the foreword to the interview there, you describe writing this book 4 years ago during the 2016 election campaign.
Yes.
And that back then, not talking about the current period, but back then, you were writing about the rise of Nazis, and that you felt that you had a lot of similarities to what was going on in the world around you today. Care to comment?
Sure, I'll comment on that. I want to say up front that I'm not here to convince anybody of anything, and I'm not here to insult anyone's particular political beliefs. You're entitled to that. For me, this was a terrifying experience. I would research in the morning, and then I would write in the afternoon, and then about 4:30 I would put on the TV, and I would hear reports of things that were said by a certain candidate and his minions that were directly taken from the Nazi playbook. And this is why it's so important that we remember what happened and exactly how it happened. And it's interesting, you talk about right now, if we knew more about the Spanish Civil War and the lead up to the Spanish Civil War, which is something that's not taught in American schools, Americans would understand more thoroughly what is happening in this country today. Fascism, I think it was Sinclair Lewis said, fascism will arrive in America carrying a cross wrapped in a flag.
Wow.
And that's prophetic. Again, people are entitled to their political beliefs, and I'm not trying to change any minds. You ask me a question, I'm answering it. It's a terrifying thing. There are too many similarities about what has happened in Europe in the past in terms of the rise of fascism in Germany, Italy, Spain, and even, communist, social, Soviet-style fascism in terms of what we're seeing in this country. And if we don't stay guarded, if we're not vigilant, this will happen here. And while we may not be threatened right now, I think we need to realize that there are forces that support a right-wing government in this country that are not the friends of the American Jewish community. If anything, they'd like to see us leave the country, and not with much of what we have, which is exactly what happened in Germany. And so, yes, it was terrifying. It was.
You said you were going to be writing a sequel to this book. Do you want to give us some hints on?
Sure, I'll tell you a little bit about that. So there's going to be 4 or 5 books in this series. I'm shooting for 5, but it may only be 4. The next book picks up in 1953 and is set against the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And I'm doing a lot of. I've got about 100 pages written. And that's about a third of the book, maybe a little less. And it has certain characters that come back. Kurt is in it, Saul is in it, and it is a completely fictitious story. But what I wanted to examine, which is why I chose this subject, was the American Jewish community's response to the Rosenberg arrest, trial, and conviction. And the truth is that the American Jewish community did very, very little to help the Rosenbergs. And in the end, from my research, I can tell you that the Rosenbergs were not guilty of what they were executed for.
Okay.
And I'm not the only writer.
Like you're hedging a little bit there, but okay.
No, I mean, I'll tell you honestly that it has pretty much been proven that she was in fact not a spy, and that Julius was a spy, but he passed along industrial espionage secrets to the Soviets, not the secret of the atom bomb. Even Einstein himself, when he saw the drawing that was used in the trial of supposedly what was passed along to the Soviets, he said, "This is a kindergartner could draw this. This is not anything." So I wanted to take a look at this, and the truth is that the American Jewish community 10 years after, or less than 10 years after the end of World War II, 10 years after the Holocaust was in full swing, was terrified of what might happen if a Jewish couple were convicted of selling out the atomic secret to the Soviets. So there was very, very little help given to them, and they had very, very poor defense, and in the end, they were executed. But I'm working on that now, and I hope to have that out in about probably the early 2022, because I have 2 books coming out next year. So
and tell us a little bit about Forgiving Stephen Redmond. You said that that's the next one that's coming out?
Yeah, Forgiving Stephen Redmond is coming out in January. So first of all, it's the 3rd piece in the Forgiving series, which consists of Forgiving Maximo Rothman and Forgiving Mariela Camacho. This book is set in the 1960s in Upper Manhattan and in the Dominican Republic. And after I wrote Forgiving Maximo Rothman, and I would do these author talks, people would ask me very frequently about loose ends, like what happened to them when they came to the United States. What happened to the Rothmans in the United States? So this kind of answers that question. It ties with a few other loose ends. I mean, for the audience, what you should know is that the whole Forgiving series are murder mysteries. So the first one is, literally a murder mystery. A guy is found dead on his living room floor, and he's a 90-year-old man. And that's Forgiving Maximo Rothman. Forgiving Mariela Camacho involves a serial killer.
Oh, dear.
Forgiving Stephen Redmond is a cold case.
Okay.
And I'm very excited about the book because it's really, it's a lot of fun. I had a good time writing it.
So we have a comment from Madeline Field, and she writes, I went to school in Forest Hills High School and had a history teacher who was not Jewish, but taught us in 1964 about Mein Kampf and that he had a friend who was German. He translated it into English, and we had to read it, plus a few other books about that time of the war and what was done to the Jewish people. Reading your book made me feel that I was back learning again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I can touch someone with my work, it makes a big difference for me. If I could very quickly mention that when this book, before the book was published, my publisher, she's out in Oregon, she had advanced copies on her coffee table, and she has her son-in-law, one of her son-in-laws, she has a lot of children, one of her son-in-laws came by and he asked if he could take a copy of the book, and she said yes, knowing full well that he's a big redneck.
Oh.
And after he read it, 2 weeks later, he came and said to her, this book changed my view of the world. So when I can do that, that means everything I've done is just more than worthwhile. That's exactly why I do it. But thank you for your compliment. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. And please, if you enjoyed it, go onto Amazon and write a review. Thank you.
So how did you learn you were an author? Meaning, like, did you always want to write? Is it something?
Tanya, that is such a great question because it's a great story. So for those of you, because I know you were all up in Stamford, I am actually from Trumbull. I went to high school in Trumbull.
Oh, Connecticut guy. Go ahead.
Yeah, my folks moved up to Trumbull from New York, from Queens, when I was 14 years old in 1970. So I went to high school, Trumbull High School, and I went to the University of Connecticut. So just before I went to UConn, my parents said to me, well, you know, what do you want to study and what do you want to be? And I said, well, I want to study English and I want to be a writer. And my parents looked at me in unison, said, no, 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 that'll never work because you'll never make a living and it's not for a Jewish boy. And I'm thinking, Herman Woke, Philip Roth, not going to make a living? So I ended up in the real estate business, the commercial mortgage business, for about 30 years. And I had always wanted to be a writer, and I used to write for various real estate newspapers, you know, as a freelance, you know, not really a freelance, you know, as a contributor. And what happened was in 2009, well, actually 2007, I took a job working for a bank in New York, and I'm going to leave the name of the bank out. It's no longer in existence, and the boss was crazy. I had no work to do, and I spent in 9 months I wrote my first manuscript, which actually was my second book, Stealing a Summer's Afternoon. And that's how I started writing, and I started taking workshops. And in 2009, with the recession, I lost the job at the bank. So that's when I really started writing full time. And what I did was I took a course and became a personal trainer to make some cash. And I started writing, and the first book I published was Forgiving Maxima Rothman, which was selected as a finalist for National Jewish Book Awards debut novel. And I've been working since then. You know, I work for a magazine. I work for The Cooperator, which publishes seven editions around the country geared towards condominium, co-op, and HOA owners. And
I interrupt you because we have another question from.
Oh, please.
So this one says, should we continue to hunt down Nazis from World War II and bring them to trial? Or does that risk making these elderly and no doubt infirm people seem so pitiful that they actually garner sympathy and make Jews seem vengeful?
Gee, what a great question. That is like the best question I have been asked since.
That's my husband.
That is a fantastic question. Thank you, Alan. Okay, so I'm kind of two minds about this. I think that initially my answer is, you know what, these people have to be brought to justice. I don't care how old they are. The problem is that, and you bring up a very good point, people who do not have a close and intimate relationship to this situation, to this history, they do look at this and say, oh, he's a 95-year-old man, he's on a walker and a wheelchair, why don't you just leave him alone and forget about it already? Mm-hmm. How about the 95-year-old Holocaust survivor who still has dreams every night of what was done to him and his family? I think if it's handled in the right way and we have the right way of presenting it, I think that we can counter the propaganda. Mm-hmm. But my initial reaction is to say there's no time limit on justice. And that's really, really important. You know?
I personally agree with you, no question about it. I have another comment, this one from Linda. quote, I loved your book. I read it 2 times. I love historical fiction and learn something from it every time I read a book like this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It does make a huge difference to me and to any author to hear a compliment like that. Thank you very, very much. And, you know, I hope that you'll hang around for the rest of my books. You know, they're all there on Amazon.
So, Connie, I'm going to invite you to come and tell us about upcoming events that you have coming up. And I want to personally thank you so much, Alan. This has been really fun, and I loved the book also and enjoyed our conversation. Take it away, Connie.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tanya and AJ. This is terrific. I just want to make one comment. You certainly have unique perspectives, AJ, and you've written about it so well, and the parallels that you see today, and you know, which is pretty scary. One of the things I'd like to say, when you mentioned education, and Linda mentioned, and Madeline, you know, that it reminds them of things that they were taught, and they learn something new all the time. And there is, since Hadassah is one of our sponsors tonight, Hadassah was one of the leading advocacy organizations behind the Never Again Education Act, which was recently passed by the Congress and signed into law. And it provides funding to teach Holocaust education, to supply resources, background materials, etc., so that this can be widely taught. And you were talking about, you know, college age students, but this is for being taught in high school and even in middle school. So I think that if books like yours belong in that kind of curriculum. So that's something I just wanted to let you know about. Yes, we have, I just want to let people know that we hope that AJ is going to join us again soon. So stay tuned. We'll let you know. And we want to, and I want to thank Tanya, because she always has this wonderful way of questioning and bringing out so much more than just a plain, why did you do this, and go on to the next question. So thank you, Tanya. And I want to invite all of you to join us for our upcoming arts and culture programs. Actually, the JCC Book Club meets this Sunday, the 13th at 11:30 a.m. on Zoom. And we especially want you to look out for the 19th season of the Jewish Film Festival of Fairfield County. And it is going virtual, of course. Mark your calendars for these award-winning films from October 15th through November 22nd. And there are going to be Q&As with directors and special experts. And we also want you to look out for our weekly arts and culture email, which lets you know everything that's going on. And one thing that is part of our J-Cares initiative at the JCC is we have a new social action committee, and we're looking for volunteers. And our first activity is going to be a voter registration drive on National Voter Registration Day, which is September 22nd. It'll be outside in front of the JCC. So please contact me if you want to be added to our mailing list and if you're not already there. And again, I want to thank everyone and thank our interested audience. It's great to have everybody here. And stay well, stay healthy, and have a sweet and healthy Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Thank you.
Good night.